This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board and emergency alert system.
Today I'm going to do some repeating. I keep getting asked questions about what we're doing with two major construction situations, one on South 45 and one on Route 150 east to St. Joe. Both are pretty major events. The 45 is mainly for Ameren power lines. The area to St. Joe is a highway expansion, but it expands adjacent to the old Conrail bed that is going to be a Kickapoo Trail, 25 miles from Urbana to Danville. Let me go to Route 45 first. A long time ago, probably as much as 40 years ago, go back to railroading early. Railroaders came first. There were no cars till there were horses and carts, and there were oxen, but the railroads came in the 1850s. Main line going south to Cairo and on to New Orleans. The roads invariably paralleled the railroad lines when they came in. They were first for horses and oxen, but gradually became highways. The highways got expanded from 2-lane roads to usually 3-lane roads. In South 45, it's a 5-lane road with a suicide lane in the middle where you get to go either way. A little bit of history here is that line to the south often is 200 feet wide, which is wide for a railroad line. It's 2 tracks, now only 1, but it's wide. The road was fairly narrow. In the early times, you could take some land out of the farming side. As farmland got to be installed, you couldn't take so easily from the farmland side, so it was taken from the space between the railroad line and the road, usually about 100 feet. So if we go to South 45, from Champaign, about where Kirby Avenue is, south to Pisodum, an area of 14 miles, was mostly prairie soil that had been relatively undisturbed on both sides of the railroad line, and that 14 miles represented some of the only prairie left in this sort of region. We managed to save some of the first mile. After that, the Department of Transportation put its road right over against the railroad line and took out all the remaining prairie soil from there to Pisodum. We saved a little bit of prairie at Airport Road, and it went to Pisodum Rest Stop, and subsequently came back to Champaign, some of it, but it's been replaced by sewer lines. The road to Pisodum has also been expanded. Now, come back to 45. Early botanists, Bliss and others, used the South 45 corridor for student demonstration of prairie. There were a very nice little piece just south of Curtis Road. It was always endangered some because there was a chance that a prairie would catch fire and violate your buildings nearby. It did happen. Let's say something about fire. Most land-based ecosystems are involved with fire. You can see it happening out the west at the moment. It's natural. It comes with lightning strikes. The lightning is on both coasts, but it's more likely to be inland because of the buildup of clouds, and you're in the center of the continent, and you don't have the calming effects of two oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific. So the prairie was very dependent on fire. So fire would encourage species that got used to it. Since glaciation 10,000 years ago, prairie plants have been coming back in. They came back in a little faster than the trees. The trees needed drainage. Cottonwoods usually are able to handle drainage. In fact, they enjoy the water. But most trees didn't come in unless there was an esker or a moraine or something with gravel that provided drainage. The forest was subject to fire also. Fire would stabilize its species. And like if you go to brownfield woods, there's 13 species of trees, and those trees would remain intact. If there was no burning, certain trees like maples are very subject to burning. So if you burn the forest, the maples would go out. So burning the prairie, whether it's by lightning or by Indians who found out that it really did help the prairie to burn it. And if you did that, you might lose a few organisms, a snake or two or a meadow vole or food. But once the prairie started to grow again, those animals multiplied, and so they would do things like make a horseshoe of a burn, and the animals would go through the open end of the horseshoe, and you could capture animals there with nets or with other instruments. Even the fire itself would probably burn some of the organisms. There was that sort of syndrome applied to the forest. So when the forest is burned, the trees that are susceptible to fire, like maples, will come back. The forest will reduce in size, and you'll lose the maples. If you don't burn, the maples will increase and the forest will increase. So there's this constant ecotone where the prairie will burn and take over the forest some, and then with a period of non-burning, the forest will come across and occupy some of the prairie. That's very typical of most land-based ecosystems. Here, when settlers came, they did not like burning. They did not like their houses burned down, and so they were seeking especially to be safe in a forested situation if they could find one, like the big grove in Havana. It was 10 square miles. That was a good place to locate. You could open up the forest a little bit and do some agriculture and work out in the prairie if you could drain it. So we did have an understanding of the prairie, but we didn't have an understanding that the prairie needed to be burned. And if you don't burn it, the litter accumulates and it burns itself. And then that's much in an uncontrolled situation. That's when you do get houses burned down. And then you see that happening out west at the moment. You see it happening in other countries where fire in a drought situation, and as the climate changes, the drought situation is existing, and that litter is dry and tender and burns easily. And plants get used to it. Over 10,000 years, they enjoy it. And if you don't provide it, they don't grow very well. So a decent prairie, if not burned, in 10 years, you see the plants the fruiting bodies getting shorter and the prairie getting shorter and certain species dropping out. So burning the prairie is very important. The Route 45 is a constant problem for burning because you have to now have a controlled burn, and you have to have a burn when there's less than a 15-mile-an-hour wind, and when the smoke is not blowing over the village of Savoy Mall or into some house where there's an allergy problem. The prairie itself burns cleanly, but if you have green material like brome grass, as is often put along the side of the road, it burns with the smoke, and you can have a very smoky situation, and traffic can have a problem. So we have a mile of prairie between Windsor Road and Curtis Road. When that was under preservation interests, say in the late 50s, early 60s, that was a 2-lane road, and the prairie was there and strongly operating. There was a little road that went over to the cruise farm, which the university now owns, and there was not much other buildings on the east side and not much on the west side. It was farmland. Later it got expanded to 3 lanes, and then later to 5 lanes. So at each stage, when the 3-lane came, a number of interested bodies got out there with front-end loaders and took some of the prairie that was sitting right now which is the center of the highway, if it had still been there. And that was moved to the prairie itself, especially to places where it was not as rich as most of the original soil. When 5 lanes came in, the same sort of thing happened, but the prairie was going to get to be less than 100 feet. It was going to get more like 50 feet. And we got a grant through Helen Satterthwaite, who was in the legislature at the time, to move some of that salvage material to Lake Park in Savoy, where Dick Burwash had allowed us to put prairie on a cornfield adjacent to a drainage ditch, and that site has continued well. Grant came to the village of Savoy. They provided the tandem trucks to move the salvage. When you load a tandem truck with 10 inches of sod, which is about what they took, it was put into the truck the right way up. But when it got dumped out of the truck, it got turned upside down. And that meant that volunteers had to spend a lot of time turning the sod over. We had the aid of a generously donated front-end loader, which could help. But if you have sod and it needs to be turned over very quickly or it will rot. So Lake Park has benefited from that activity. Other people, there's Barnharts, who have, as part of 100 acres of prairie on Yankee Ridge at the end of Ray Street and Church. They took some of the salvage material to augment their beginning prairie there. That prairie has become very well recognized. The soil and water conservation people have helped, set-asides have helped. So some of the material went there. Other material went to individuals who were interested and wanted to preserve the site. We have a Savoy Prairie Society that helped to do this. And later we have a student group that's quite interested and helpful, which is the red bison. Red bison refers to a cloud of red smoke and ash coming from a prairie burn that looks like a bison. If you use your imagination, you can get that connotation. Well, that's sort of somewhat the background. Each time you widen a road, the Department of Transportation and a whole bunch of other people are involved. And we have to deal with, perhaps this, let me list some of the people. The Savoy Village, IDOT, the Department of Transportation, the railroad, which is adjacent and has some of the right-of-way, Illinois Central then, Canadian National now, ID&R, Illinois Department of Natural Resources, because they are they control endangered species, for instance. Is there a Franklin ground squirrel on this site? They would also you relate to the water survey to see that little rills of water that are coming into the site are considered. Usually the road has its own right-of-way, but they take on a construction easement on the side that's adjacent, either side, so that they can, one, park heavy equipment, which has to be parked somewhere, and you can't park it on the highway, and materials, and also to work the little rills of water that come in from different directions, and sometimes that may have to be an under highway drain that drains the village on the west side. Let me add now a few other groups of people. There's, first of all, a consideration of whether this site has quality. So you have to work with people from the Natural History Survey. Usually it's called calamity money. Money is given by the state for the Natural History Survey or the Water Survey to look at sites like the prairie range of prairie species, the quality of prairie species, and for water, the wetlands, which are often regarded as endangered sites and a little sloppy. You're on the backside of a moraine, a Pasota moraine, so it is sort of soft material. And so experts are expected to do that. Not always do we have that total involvement. You have to be alert and aware, perhaps 8 years before a road goes in, to record this information and to convince people that you're working with a prairie that has wonder. You look for species. One of the species that was important to us was Ceanothus, or New Jersey tea, and that was an indicator. Culver's root, or there's a bunch of things that are there that are part of this prairie and makes it recognizable as original. To work that territory, we had to have heavy equipment, and we had to have lots of volunteers. The prairie material that we took to Lake Park was taken in the construction season and in the middle of summer. You have to know that this area has rain in the spring, rain in the fall, and when you're in the middle of July, you have a drought. So that's not an ideal time to remove prairie and reestablish it somewhere. So we had to have the volunteer help of all the houses that are adjacent to the prairie and Lake Park. They all provided backyard hoses to provide water for this particular effort. we did convince the Department of Transportation contractors, and you have to realize that there are planners that plan this plan 8 years in advance, so it's not easy to change it. There are the implementers, the region. This region is Paris, and the Paris region is going to supervise this project. And they're given a bunch of plans that are almost set in concrete. There can be a few little changes. They usually have checked with cities and all the other agencies who we're talking about. And then there's usually a period when the public is told what is going to happen. The public doesn't always have a lot of input unless you're rather clever to be able to go to Springfield, find the organization that's doing the planning and as under contract, and talk to them perhaps 8 years before something happens. Otherwise, there's a bunch of people who only find out about what's happening when it happens. There's the police and fire department people that's brought in probably after the fact, because there is a concern about burning, and there's a concern about the strange weeds on the side of the railroad line that can house people. I can remember the day when I was harvesting Indian grass down there, and all of a sudden had 3 police cars come to a sudden halt alongside me, with the car moving back and forth because it had stopped so quickly. And what had happened is someone with a cell phone had reported me as a subterfuge for breaking into the bank across the road. So yes, there are strange things that happen, and if you are in the way as an individual, you might have to just relate to the police or fire department. If you if you try to burn the corridor by yourself and you get into strife, then the fire department will appear. So we have to sort of after the fact look at some of these things. The U of I is in there. The U of I is in there with the Natural History Survey to start with, the Water Survey and other groups. But then you get the Red Bison and the Students for Environmental Concern and Sierra and Waterborne and others that have modestly been involved in trying to preserve that site. Our own organization, Heartland Pathways, has been in there, and we have photographs from that era, and it would be kind for you folks to know that that has gone on for a long time. We especially need to talk to the groups that are doing things. So if they're road builders, we need to be able to talk to those road builders. It's not always easy. You're perhaps sitting on the side of a tractor shouting to the driver who might also be on a cell phone. It's $100 an hour to talk to someone because they have jobs to do and they have equipment that's rented and it's heavy-duty stuff. I would like to say that the Prairie is heavy-duty stuff too, but it doesn't look like it. Now, the first widening was modest. The second widening included these conservation easements, but we eventually did get the machinery to park elsewhere, not to park on the Prairie. The Prairie will survive. It's got deep roots, and it will survive a lot of activity, but the more you disturb it, the more you add weeds, and it doesn't look like a prairie anymore. Not that people know the difference between weeds and prairie. They look somewhat the same, and for 6 generations we've been getting rid of the prairie as weeds, so they're often called weeds, warts, curses, and banes, because there were things that had to be removed in order to drain and then grow crops. So we got over that one with movement of some plants, and But that wasn't all of it. The prairie proper is still vulnerable. The roadside people usually tend to borrow from the nearest place that they can get hold of it. Borrow is where you take gravel or clay to work the road. And in the case of Windsor Road and Curtis Road, they needed borrow to augment the side of the roads near the lights at Windsor Road. And so we had to give over to that. We made an arrangement where they moved 10 inches of prairie to either side, and then they dug the clay. The clay is better for road building than topsoil, although the topsoil sometimes is advantageous. They plant often brome grass and other plants that grow quickly and give an instant gratification, and our prairie doesn't do that. So if you move that soil aside, you're moving, even if the prairie plants don't survive themselves, the seed is there. And then when the borrow was taken, the material was moved back. It was softer than a normal prairie, which kind of gets hard. And soft enough that I can remember getting a backhoe bogged in it, but it has come back as a wonderful little prairie. We have dipsy-doodled into it a little bit, but with seed that is typical of the area. We were kind of amazed by the ceanothus, or the New Jersey tea. It was a plant that is a shrub on the prairie, and it has a tremendous root system. And it was a bane to most farmers because you could break your plow on this plant. And so people like John Deere had to invent a plow which, if the plow hit the plant, it would stump up over. It's called a stump jump plow. It had a spring, and the plow would go over and then come down again. Or you had a piece of wood which would break so that the plow would go over it. Various forms of stump jump were devised. It's called stump jump because when you took down a woods, you had stumps and you had the same problem. But this was a problem. You probably should have called it a root jumper. Yes, I'm trying to think of what I might to call it. The plant had various names because it was really hard to work with. It's fairly rare. We're beginning to pick the seed of it right now, and the seed sells for up to about $600 a pound. And David has helped me to pick some of that seed, and I'll need volunteers to help pick that seed shortly. So borrow was taken, and that has come back, and it's really nice. Now, when you're talking to, let's go to what is happening now, what you're seeing down there, and people don't understand it. The Ameren used to be Illinois Power, is increasing its grid across the country and in this area. The grid goes on the south side of Champaign and has offshoots going up to the university. The headquarters for this, or the amalgamation of the lines going into it, are behind St. Mary's Cemetery on St. Mary's Road, and just east of the railroad line at Hillcrest, and sort of in that First Street area that the university is doing research with. And I think some of this power coming in is not only used by the university, but it is also a situation where the Ameren itself will do some research. Well, this power line's been coming in for quite some time. They have been on the east side of the railroad line, so they haven't affected the little Route 45 prairie. It's on the west side. But now there's the west side. And we've known about this, so we've been in contact with Ameren, and Michelle Henderson is their representative for that type of power line. And we managed to get it mown. The Ameren itself wanted to mow the trees that are left. We spent a lot of time an energy getting rid of trees because we knew that trees can short the power lines. So the prairie was basically 3/4 without trees, but at the end near to Windsor Road where there's a the railroad line was lifted up 7 feet and moved east 25 feet, and a new bridge was put in. So there was lots of disturbance and activity there and fill. So that was where there was a lot of trees. We kept removing them, but they grow fast. So the answer here was to work together. There's a temptation sometimes to herbicide things. So we didn't want herbicide on the prairie. But there's another alternative, which is to take a construction hi-ho and put a mower on the end of it, a bush hog mower, and go to the top of a tree and down to the roots. And that it doesn't need herbicide to say that that plant is dead. If it's autumn olive or something like that and has seeds, we'll have seeds to deal with. But, that's how that was dealt with. Probably $200 an hour. A 10-hour day, like 200 gallons of gas. A bobcat to do small mowing too. Brought in from St. Louis. This is heavy-duty stuff. Now, we've been talking last week about what some of the next steps are, is to put in pedestals for towers, best part of 100 feet tall. When there is a corner where lines are coming in from different directions, the tower has to be very large. Some of the pedestals are 60 feet deep and 10 feet wide. The hole is dug by a drill. It's like taking a hand drill with a big a blade on the bottom, and it throws the dirt out. Room is made for a concrete installation with all the steel that goes in there to make the concrete strong. Some of the steel is an inch thick, tremendous. So you need cranes to lift this sort of thing. You need a crane to lift the drilling equipment. Yeah, at the junction just south of Arby's restaurant at the moment, there's a hole there that has to be accessed. Well, the hole is very near to a detention pond that's about 15 feet deep, so that hole has been filled with gravel so that the equipment can stand on it and drill the hole. When the hole is finished and the pedestal is installed and the tower is installed, the gravel will be removed for use in other places, and the detention pond will serve its function. That will be a big hole. When you get onto a line like on our prairie, there probably will be only 6 foot wide and perhaps 20 feet deep. But you have to be deep because this is the backside of a moraine. And the backside of the moraine is kind of sloppy where the ice and snow used to melt and run back into the Ombra and down in front of the Yankee Ridge. So if you don't have a very deep pylon, then you might have that tower bend over. If, for instance, you're dealing with elevators, if you don't load them properly, sometimes the elevator will turn over. So we know that also these pedestals sometimes gradually move into the ground because they have weight, and over the years they will disappear. So this you have to put a time span on this. This is perhaps a 75-year job, and it's in action now. We don't receive as a sort of handshake group. We have been able to work with the Department of Transportation. They have said to us, okay, we're widening the road. We'll put on the downslope from the edge of the road down into the gutter, we'll put grasses, and especially switchgrass, which to us has become, it's a prairie plant, but it's become a weed because it's been used too much and it's too thick. And it produces too much litter, and then it becomes a fire hazard. So there's grasses down to the ditch, and then up the ditch to the prairie proper is we were allowed to put more range of seed. The end near Windsor Road has been hydroseeded. Hydroseed means that you put the seed into water and you blow it onto the awkward places to get to. We were allowed to put in seed. I was totally appalled when I saw that the seed that was being sown was from Kansas. It's easier to harvest seed in Kansas because you have big fields and you can harvest it with a combine harvester, and it costs less. If you've got to do native seed, it has to, it costs. You have to have people out there picking seed. Grand Prairie Friends does it all the time. We do it all the time. And you can recreate a prairie like Meadowbrook with that seed. The problem we have with construction groups is that they're not usually told what the plans are other than the plans that they're actually dealing with. They don't know that we're a prairie group. They don't know that the plants there may be 50 different species. You're very lucky to be able to talk for a little while, but they have a job to do, and it's very confined to what they do. That's whether it's a drilling crew or preparing the culverts. So we didn't want the prairie accessed linearly. That's often the way power lines work, is they go linearly along the area between the railroad and the road, and that's detrimental to the prairie because it means a lot of activity and all your prairie gets zapped. Better to have a culvert that comes in across the area that the Department of Transportation has given us as a handshake agreement, but they put it in signs. It's quasi-legal, but you don't have a place on the plans that say you have to work with this sort of group. And it looks a little strange because this is one of the few times that these crews encounter this sort of situation. So how do you get to know? You have to go and visit and talk to people, and that can be a challenge. It can be very friendly, and surprisingly, the contractors are, well, not so surprisingly, but they're quite interested in and very helpful. So, in the case of these culverts, the construction easement, I keep talking about that, but the construction easement is 100 feet by 60 feet. The culvert that's put in first goes down a blanket of plastic, then goes down a 50-foot long drain that is 2 feet tall. That takes the water that normally ran along that corridor. If you have a 5-inch drain, it would satisfy. Then gravel is put on the top to the upside of the drain that is adjacent to the real prairie. That to us was pretty okay because that's been planted prairie, and it's a little more expendable than the prairie proper. We had survey marked. We knew where the towers were to be, and that we could look at certain sites that are better than others, and we know what we might lose. The topsoil cannot be taken anywhere else because the railroaders and the Department of Transportation don't like soil that's near the railroads going anywhere because it might carry EPA problems, and there might be a suit here and there. So we can't really salvage it easily, and we can't salvage from the construction site if we don't have use of the culvert. We were told we could have a hard hat and jacket that's obvious, and especially after hours we might be able to do something about salvaging. The prairie soil is fairly firm. You go to it with a shovel, you're not going to salvage very many plants in a short while. But then all of a sudden the prairie gets mown again. So there is the baptisia, the prairie clover, the coneflowers, the liatris, all scrunched up and not salvageable before this culvert is even finished. And then all of a sudden there are culverts in adjacent to poles, and we weren't told about this at all. So why is that happening? Is that to pull the pole after the no. This is because the the poles have to be removed, but the wires on the poles have to be extended up in order to make room for the cranes that come in to do their work. So even though the pole is not on the site of the construction, they want that room. So the wires are there. So, okay, can the poles be taken out now? Because you've got the culvert in and it's covering up the prairie, and can you take it off and go? Oh no, these wires that are up there now are going to be the wires that pull the new cable through. So you have to wait till we're done with the new towers in, and then this will be used in that. So, that's going to take 2 months, yes, perhaps at least a month. So the prairie will be covered up. We hope it will come back. But to ask questions, you have to be there when the persons are doing it. And they're often very expert at doing what they're doing. But they haven't encountered this sort of situation before. There's an easement, and they have a total easement. This is not a situation where you're going over houses. It's a situation where you're going over an unknown prairie. And so we haven't been contacted. We don't have plans. We just see it when it's happening. So you've got to be there and talk. And then if you take photographs, that could be a problem too, because you might just be checking out what's going on. And that's so too. We have just had 4 miles of prairie. We bought the railroad bed for its prairie, and Ameren, the same Ameren, has blanket herbicided a large percentage of that site, even though we had no trees under the power lines to short of the power lines. So yes, we're a little cautious. We need to watch what's going on, because sometimes innocently you don't know what new measure will happen. So the situation where we have new culverts adjacent to old power poles was happening without our knowing. And then I asked, and the people who were in charge said they didn't know either. So you tacitly given an opportunity to move things and do things, and you can be in the way by asking questions, and you can be in the way by actually being in a dangerous situation. I'm very careful not to be doing that, but there is a threat of photography in what you do. Workers, I like to photograph workers doing their job, because so very many few people see what workers are doing, and they're really doing an excellent job. But sometimes workers are not so sure about being photographed. Other workers are really don't mind you doing that at all, because they know that the public doesn't know what they're doing. I do it in the streets when they're doing streetscapes and things like that, because not everyone knows. So that's about where we are with that at the moment. You might have a question.
Yeah, twice now at least you've mentioned that you haven't found out until the last minute. You practically had to be proactive, checking out places where there were prairies to actually go out and say, "Oh, look, they're spraying on our land. They shouldn't do that. Oh, they're planning to dig up and use our good prairie soil. How about if you just moved that soil aside and used what you can really use, the clay beneath it?" Now, there's the Julie plan, which you in fact talked about before. If you want to go digging anywhere, you need to make sure that there aren't any cables down there. Is there nothing whatsoever in place to make sure that people know this area here is not public land, this is private land? You need to check with Heartland Pathways or whoever to find out, or other CCDC or whoever, to get their permission or to maybe get some advice on them, the proper way to go about doing something
Well,
here.
they're the controllers of Julie. I forget exactly what Julie stands for, but it's a siting organization. If you're in Ameren, you know that one. You've done that.
And that's a legal requirement. It seems like it ought to be. These people are trespassing. You'd think that there has to be a legal requirement that they make sure that they're not intruding where they're explicitly not supposed to be, at least without checking with these people up front.
Yes. Well, we would like them to check the prairie, to know there's a prairie. And that involves going back to engineers understanding some of the sociology and the biology of the site, and that's up to us. That's what we do with Heartland Pathways and the like, is to try and educate people. And I go to railroad seminars, and part of the reason is to educate, and part of the reason is to understand what is their constraints. There's a tremendous drive to remove land and then replace it with something that is a rinky-dink and not really 10,000 years old. So I have a few minutes left. So yes, we have to be aware. Now, on the other side, we have 150, and we have a cottonwood situation. For those of you who know the area, it's east of Walmart. It's near to John Deere organization. It's on cottonwood, and I've talked to you about trees, and trees liking to have wet situations, so it's named appropriately. This section of the road between Urbana and St. Joe is wet in a rainstorm, and it's wet to being inconvenient. I've been worried about where the water goes, and we talked about that last week a little bit, so I won't repeat that, but we did get maps from Bill Saylor and a water survey that showed where that water's supposed to go. So yesterday I went out and walked the area. What I'm worried about is that water that comes into that Cottonwood intersection with 150 is coming off various hills, and a hill in east central Illinois doesn't have to be very high, but it's a wet spot. So are we creating a detention pond that sinks into the aquifer, or where does it run if it's going to run? So I've asked questions about that several times and have found maps, but I walked the farm field, and there's absolutely there's an old road, but there's absolutely no drainway across the cornfield and across the soybean field nearby. Either that has been a grass waterway that has been taken over for more corn and soybeans, or it never was a grass waterway and never was a drain. When you get to 74 to the north, there is a drain under the 74, and it runs into the Salt Fork Creek with quite a deep little gully. So yesterday I was doing that, and then I went over to St. Joe proper, near to the Pioneer Grain, and I was disappointed because I had thought that we were giving over prairie soil for carving off and replacing some. I didn't expect what I saw. What happened is they take a disc plow and plow the area so it's soft. Then they take a rotary tiller and they till the soil. So this is a preservation site that has suddenly become a reconstruction site. So we can reconstruct it, we can sow seed, and we can sow the seeds as designated by the DOT if necessary. But it leaves the soil soft, and all the plants that were there are destroyed. We'll have the seed, but I had thought that a bulldozer could go along and gently cut the soil where it needed and place it where needed without having to dig it up and recreate it. And it's an engineering principle that is understandable because it's easier to work with soil that is soft, but wow, it takes out all the plants we thought we were saving. So I was somewhat disturbed by that. Took lots of photographs again, and wondered. It's in an area where the gutter, the down and the up gutter, is not that great. And I would like to see that gutter filled with small prairie plants, like little bluestem and the like, that would allow us to not mow that site. That is a tremendous challenge to the Department of Transportation because it is assumed that everyone likes to have the area mown. There's a feeling, especially on north-south corridors, that the snow will accumulate. If you have a nucleus of a prairie plant, then the snow will accumulate, and you'll have a drift, and someone will get to lose their life in a drift. And so that's legitimate, especially on north-south corridors where the wind is blowing the snow across. But this is an east-west corridor. It's a gentle ditch, and one of the major problems is that the mowers that are employed to do mowing on the roadside are 15 or 16 feet wide. And although in certain times of the year the edict is to mow down to the ditch, not anymore, often the area is mown down to the ditch and up because the mowers don't like to hang out on the main road. The answer to that is you buy in some small tractors. You had another question?
No. 1 minute.
Okay. So we're pleased to be a party to all this, and there'll be more, and we'll try and put up pictures and maps in on YouTube. So go to YouTube, especially one very good one that David has helped with a lot is August 27th, and it'll list some of these things and show you the culverts and the like. And I've been meeting people out there who are wondering what's going on, and some of them are very, very excited to do things, and I think we're okay. The Forest Preserve, which owns the adjacent Kickapoo Trail, is taking some of the soil, and the Department of Natural Resources and the Committee on Natural Areas and others are working at this, and we're pleased to be doing things. So this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.